Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's story is a 3-part series from the incredible mind of PeterVOX19 over on Reddit No Sleep. And as ever, please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid crew. And so, with that aside, let's get into tonight's story. Entitled, My Uncle's Cabin. Part 1. Let's get straight into that. The summer before my freshman year of college, my uncle called me up and asked me if I'd be willing to help him fix up his cabin during the summer's warm weather. I eagerly agreed, because I hadn't been to the cabin since I was just a little guy, and so I was more than excited to go back. Plus, I was basically the only adolescent in the family, and I surely wasn't going to turn down my elderly uncle's request to help with physical labor. A week before I was supposed to head out for the cabin, I got another call from my uncle. Unfortunately, it turned out he'd just suffered a pretty severe heart attack. The guy was as strong as an ox and wouldn't let anything knock him on his ass, and so I was pretty surprised to hear that he wasn't going to work on the cabin that summer. He assured me that it would be okay and we could do it next summer, but I had just turned 18 and I was young, dumb and full of, well, you know. Anyways, I practically begged him to let me go work on the cabin by myself, and eventually he did give in. My uncle sent me a list of tasks and instructions to help complete them. I only anticipated me being up there for a week or two at max, and so that was encouraging. However, when I saw the list, I was immediately concerned. It was obvious that my uncle had overestimated my abilities and clearly held nothing back and gave me every task he could think of. I had no idea on how to do half the things that were on that list, and so I was expecting to be at the cabin a little bit longer than I expected. And I was wrong. The road to the cabin is long, winding, treacherous, and made of loose dirt. On one side is a large rock face, while the other side looks straight down into a gorge filled with lush green pine trees. I understand that I'm explaining this in a way that makes it sound rather dangerous, and that is true, but I truly can't emphasize the beauty of the landscape. Whether it was the risk of driving off the edge of a cliff or the excitement of laying eyes on the cabin for the first time in 10 years, I was sweating. I could feel the little beads dribble down my side in an almost ticklish manner, chilling my torso. After around 20 minutes of following that daunting path, I came around the final corner, and there, staring back at me, was the dilapidated cabin that I loved so dearly. Holy shit, did that thing look rough. You know the cabin from the Evil Dead? Yeah, like that. I immediately knew I had a lot of work cut out for me, but part of me was ecstatic at the thought of completing such difficult chores. I imagined bragging to all of my new friends I'd make in college about the time I single-handedly fixed my family's cabin. When I got out of the truck, it was sometime in the late afternoon. I knew I wouldn't be able to get much done that night, so I walked around the property and did a brief inspection of the area. Everything seemed to be just fine. I remember seeing a cluster of greyish fur on one of the trees. I suppose it could have been from a deer, but now looking back at it, I think it was foreshadowing the encounter that I would have later that night. After I finished my walk through and I wandered over to the small babbling brook that runs along the side of the property and dipped my right hand into the cold mountain stream, I cupped my hand and scooped some of the water into my mouth. The water was clean, clear, and it tasted real. Unfortunately, not many people have the privilege of tasting clean, natural water. As I stood up from the creek, I thought about how lucky I was to be there, and for the first time, I really took in my surroundings. When I scanned the tree line and the hills that surrounded the cabin, I suddenly realized that the entire area looked different from how I remembered it. I mean, it all looked the same, but so much more dead. Not only was the cabin way past the point of being rustic, but many of the trees surrounding the property had been turned a sickly brownish grey, and a lot of the grass had either died or been washed away by the heavy rains that frequented the area. While it made me sad to see, it didn't raise any alarms. My dad grew up in Montana and had educated me on the pine beetles when we visited his hometown. They were a species of beetle that came from British Columbia and affected many of the forests of the northwestern United States. And so I merely assumed that they were behind the death of many of the trees, and the cabin had simply succumbed to the years of neglect after my elderly uncle could no longer make frequent trips up the mountain. At this time, my stomach growled so loud I thought it might have been a frog hiding somewhere in the creek. Upon realizing that it came from my gut, I promptly made my way back to the truck. I loaded some of the food and gear, and then headed for the fire pit that sat in front of the cabin. At least, what was left of the fire pit. It clearly hadn't seen use in the last 10 years either, and all but 2 of the small stones which created an almost perfect circle still stood in place. And unsurprisingly, there were no charred pieces of firewood or piles of light grey ash to prove that fires had once been common here. And so, I gathered some more rocks from the creek to complete the ring and made my way over to the stockpile of firewood that remained behind the cabin. And thankfully, the wood was covered so rain never got to it, but the thought of a large black widow digging its sleek fangs into my flesh sent chills down my spine. Well, there were all too many spider webs, but thankfully no spiders in sight. And so I grabbed for 4 medium pieces of wood and made my way back to the fire pit. After stacking the wood over some crumpled up newspapers I brought with me, I tossed a match in and took a deep breath as I sat on one of the large logs that bordered the fire. I waited a while for the flames to die down before I skewered a hot dog and began roasting it over the open fire. Oh, nothing beats that feeling. A long day of driving out into the wilderness, topped off with a delicious Hebrew national, cooked over a wild flame. Yeah, needless to say, 18-year-old me felt like he was on top of the world right about then. I chowed down on my meal, munching on some chips and sipping on a beer I may or may not have snagged from the fridge before my father could interject. And upon filling my once empty stomach, a cool breeze caused me to shiver, duplicating the sensation of someone breathing down your neck. I swiveled around almost instinctively, and while I didn't explicitly see anything right then, I was pretty sure I heard some branches crunch under something heavy. Oh, that feeling of being on top of the world suddenly faded as the true feeling of being alone started to set in. As fast as I could, I threw the remaining food into my beer canister, tied a knot to the top of the canister, and flung it over a nearby branch. Oh, there weren't any grizzlies in Central Oregon, as far as I knew, but having a mama black bear and her 2 cubs walked into my campsite, well, that was not on my agenda, and so I took the necessary precautions regardless. I had originally planned on sleeping inside the cabin, but when I saw the state of the cabin, I quickly decided on sleeping in the truck. Well, despite being summertime, the sky was quickly flooding with darkness. I grabbed a bucket of water from the creek and put the fire all the way out before making my way for the truck. I sat in the passenger seat, reclined the chair as far back as I could, and threw a blanket over myself and closed my eyes for the night. I woke up in the middle of the night surrounded by blackness and the pounding of rain against the windshield. Initially I assumed that it was the rain which had awoken me, but I was proven wrong when I heard a blood-curdling screech come from the trees. I shot up out of my prone position, made sure all the doors were locked, and put the keys in the ignition. As soon as the truck started, I powered its headlights on. Nothing. I pushed the left lever forward and toggled the truck's blinding high beams on. Nothing. But then I saw movement. I couldn't tell what it was at first, but I thought I could make out antlers, not different from that of an elk. But then it stood up on 2 legs. The lights caught the creature's eyes, reflecting back an equally blinding light. It raised its wolf-like head and let out a howl that sounded like a mix between a cougar and Godzilla. It then became apparent what the creature was hunched over, the large bloodied corpse of a fully grown American black bear. Its head lowered as it set its sights on the truck, letting out a visible snarl. It dropped what appeared to be the head of the bear from its clawed left hand, as its humanoid body, covered in patchy grey fur, began to make its way towards me. I practically jumped into the driver's seat, threw it in reverse and flung the truck around as fast as I possibly could, narrowly avoiding a creek and somehow not getting stuck in the muddied ground. However, my relief was short-lived when I saw the tree which sat in the middle of the road. I didn't know if the storm had toppled a large pine tree, or if the creature back near the cabin was really that powerful, and I had no intentions of finding out. But what choices did I have? The only road out was blocked by a collapsed tree, and right behind me was an 8-foot-tall, hulking monstrosity, who just decapitated an adult bear. My questions would soon cease to matter, as I heard the rush of water to my right. I got a quick glance at the brownish tsunami that had been caused by the night's torrential downpour, right before the mudslide shot down the rock face and swiftly pushed the large truck over the edge of the gorge. I must have blacked out when the truck was hit by the mudslide, because I have no memory of what happened immediately after that. What I do remember is waking up still shrouded in darkness. My ass was wet with what I assumed to be water, which had leaked into the truck from the mudslide. However, I soon realized that whatever I was sitting on was much different from the cushioned seat I was previously in. My vision was foggy and so was my mind. But slowly consciousness crept over me, and I started to realize that I was no longer in the safety of the truck. When I had heard the bear earlier that night, the truck proved to be a safety blanket of sorts. I knew that as long as I was in the truck, I was protected. Well, now I no longer had the safety blanket, and I was most certainly no longer protected. I attempted to stand up, but the ground slid out beneath me, as if I was standing on a bunch of marbles. A rattling followed. It was similar to the sound of sticks clacking together. I felt the ground around me, and my hands instantly found a round, dry object. I picked it up and tried to figure out what it was based on feeling alone. If it was pitch black outside, wherever I was now was Vanta black in comparison. I don't know if it was the concussion that I clearly had or just pure denial, but I knew what I was holding. I didn't want to believe it. A bone of some kind. A bone the size of a pomegranate. A bone with a dome-like structure. A bone with 2 eye sockets. I was not just holding a bone. I was holding a human skull. A child's skull. I dropped it immediately when I realized what I was holding. The crack that echoed through the layer made my heart sink. If that thing was in here, I definitely heard the ruckus that I just caused. A few moments passed and I heard nothing. However, light slowly began to filter in through an entrance, revealing my surroundings. There were so many bones, human and animal. The light also revealed that the walls, floor, and ceiling were all made of stone. A little trip from somewhere in the cave echoed, and I started to think about the monster I had seen earlier. I had only encountered it at night, and this was clearly its home. I put 2 and 2 together and realized that that thing would soon be home upon sunrise. I quickly collected myself and started rummaging around, aimlessly trying to come up with a plan, or find a sharp bone or something. I was in a life or death situation, and my lizard brain was going full force. The beast would kill me, or I would kill it. After rummaging for a few minutes, I heard another screech come from outside. It wasn't in the cave yet, but it was coming home soon. Right then, my eyes caught the bright green fabric of a large backpack. I scrambled through the bones and made my way over to the bag, which, upon closer inspection, was still attached to its owner. Needless to say, there wasn't much left of him besides the ribcage that the bag strap was caught on. I yanked and yanked, eventually hearing the snap of a rib breaking off. As soon as the bag was in my hands, I reached for the zipper. Digging through the bag's pouches, I found some rotten food, presumably a sandwich they had packed for the day hike, some socks and an empty water bottle, and a flare gun. I let out a small yelp of excitement, thinking that I'd found what may just save my life. Just then, I heard another screech, much louder this time, pounding off the walls of the damp cavern. Just moments later, I heard the thumping of footsteps enter the cave. I did my best to recreate the position I'd woken in. I didn't have time to make an elaborate plan, but I came up with something that might just save my life. My eyes were closed, but I could hear it closing in on me. I held the flare gun under my back, in my right hand, waiting for just the right moment. And soon I felt its warm breath hit my face like a train hitting a brick wall. The stench was unbearable, a combination of decomposing tissue and rotting teeth. I held my breath as best I could, but when it let out another screech point blank, I vomited a little in my mouth. I am lucky it didn't deafen me, but the small burp I let out surely let it know that I was wide awake. I opened my eyes and it roared again, spewing stinking slobber all over me. I took my chance and raised the small red firearm directly into its snout and pulled the trigger. Click, click. Fucking work, goddammit! I yelled in the same way one might yell a battle cry, pulling the trigger once more. Bang! The bright red flare shot instantly into the beast's mouth, soaring into the back of its throat. It staggered, clearly thrown off guard by the bizarre stunt that I just pulled. It screeched. This time, however, the screech ended in a whimper, as if its wolf-like head popped like a balloon. Each of its eyeballs burst out in their sockets as red cracks began to form all over its head, and soon enough those cracks began to glow a vibrant red. I'm not ashamed to admit that I cracked a small but short-lived smile as each individual piece of skull splattered the cave walls. I heard the antlers bounce off the stone of the cave and eventually clatter to the floor. The body wobbled as the knees grew weak under the weight of its enlarged abdomen and then collapsed to the ground. I stood up, dropped the flare gun, and started to make my victorious limp to the mouth of the cave. I took one last look at the hideous remains that lay in front of me, still spewing blood out of its neck. Even though its brain matter painted all of the surrounding surfaces, it still made me shiver in fear. I thought of each piece flying back into place as if someone had recorded it and played it in reverse. And with that disturbing thought, I decided I didn't want to wait around and see if it would happen or not. And so I hobbled the rest of the way out of the cave. When I got out, I looked back into the darkness one more time. No eyes peered back at me. Nothing came running out to get me. It was just me in the darkness. I followed the creek and it brought me back to the spot where I had previously indulged on some delicious mountain water. And with familiar surroundings around me, I began to relax somewhat, but still shivered from the aftershock of adrenaline. From there, I followed the road down to where the truck was pushed over the edge. And when I got there was still some muddy water running down the cliff in the form of a small waterfall. But, for the most part, the rain had come to an end, and the wave of mud had come as quickly as it had gone. I peered over the edge and saw the bright red truck upside down about 100 feet downhill. I thought about going down and grabbing my phone from the truck, but with my bum leg, I knew it would be too risky. And so I made my way down the road by foot. And by the time I reached another house, my legs were aching and my head pounded so hard I thought my skull was going to explode too. The light orange of sunrise had begun to fade into the darker tone of sunset. I must have been walking for at least 8 hours, and I was exhausted. I made it up to the 4 steps, knocked on a large wood door, and collapsed. About 2 hours later, I awoke once again, this time in a greenish-blue bed. I was now wearing a spotted white gown and had an IV pumping into my arm. I instantly recognized my surroundings as the hospital and rested my head on the pillow, letting out a sigh of relief. It wasn't until the next morning that I would speak with anyone. My parents drove the same long trek I did the day prior, the previous night, and got to the hospital later than they would have liked. However, they let me get my much-needed rest, and then proceeded to grill me the next morning. Me and your mother are so proud of you for making it to the Henderson's properties, son. We are so thankful that you're still with us. But please, tell us what happened out there. My dad's voice shook as tears formed in his eyes. I scanned the room and saw that there were 2 cops standing on the opposite side of me. I sat up on the bed and then proceeded to tell them exactly what happened, not leaving out one detail. Well, they were obviously very skeptical, but I had shown up on a stranger's doorstep covered in blood that wasn't mine, and as far as they knew, I was alone up there. I felt like I needed to tell my story the way it happened, regardless of fear or of being judged, and thankfully, they believed me. A week later, I was sitting in bed with a cast, watching movies and playing video games when my family was contacted by the police. Now, apparently, they had found the cave, and the bones, and it. They were able to match the bones to around 30 missing campers, hikers, and hunters that had been stalked, killed, and dragged to the bottom of the cave. They claimed that my encounter was actually some feral cannibal that decided to wear an animal's head over his own. That's some bullshit, huh? Anyways, that happened around 7 years ago. Nowadays, I teach biology at a community college near Seattle. That encounter changed my life forever, and not just mentally. I know the police were wrong, not because of my memory, but because I still have the foot-long scars that his claws left on my back. After my experience, apparently they demolished the cabin to prevent other potential feral people from taking shelter there, and they gated off the road. My uncle passed away a few months later, but not before I got to tell him what happened. He was astounded to hear about it, but he was aware of the cave. He told me that he'd explored the cave when he was younger, only to find nothing. I recently heard a very similar incident in Oregon, not too far from where my uncle's cabin used to be. I know that whatever I encountered is long dead, but if someone else had a similar run-in, does that mean that there are more of them? I don't know for sure, but I want to find out. Which is exactly why I'm going to Oregon next week to interview the victim. My Uncle's Cabin. Part 2. The Cheryl Winslow interview. Let's get straight into that. 3 weeks ago, Cheryl Winslow was found several miles downstream from a campsite, washed ashore the Grand Ronde River near the town of Rogersburg, Oregon. And while Cheryl herself didn't sustain any injuries, save for nearly drowning, hypothermia, and a minor concussion, her husband Howard and 7-year-old daughter Violet were found half-eaten and mutilated along the forest floor. The bottom half of their 6'3", 195-pound man was all that was left of him, until the police noticed his left arm dangling from a pine tree. A bloody trail followed the headless torso of the child, and police labeled it as a feral human attack, the same bullshit excuse they gave me when I encountered the same creature that brutalized the man and his daughter. What it really is, who knows for sure. Based on its physical appearance and lust for human blood, a lot of you seem to think that it's a Wendigo. I don't know if that's true or if it's some other chimera of a beast, but nonetheless, I appreciate the help from you guys on the last post. A lot of you provided some really insightful information. Well, the main reason why Cheryl's story stuck out to me so much was that it was the only one I'd heard with such a high level of brutality similar to mine. Many people report seeing cryptids walk or run between some trees in the distance, or report hearing some blood-curdling scream. And while these encounters might be legitimate, the gruesomeness is what concerns me. These creatures aren't some passive cryptid like a Bigfoot or a skunk ape. They are apex predators that will devour any living thing in their path. I had called Cheryl just before I posted the first part of my story, and she agreed to have an interview with me. I drove down to Pendleton, Oregon 2 days ago and conducted that interview. And as you will soon see, it was thought-provoking, to say the least. I recorded a conversation on my phone. Most of this post will be dialogue, so it's essentially served as a transcription I know some people can be squeamish even towards textual gore, so here's your graphic content warning. Things are about to get pretty dark. Hi Cheryl, how are you today? Things have been hard lately, but today has been better than last, so that's something, I guess. Well, you should know that it's okay not to feel okay during a time like this. I know how devastating it can be. I truly am sorry for your loss. Thank you, Peter. I really do appreciate it. Of course. So, Cheryl, I want to do this in a way that respects your grieving process. I want you to start off wherever you're comfortable. Thank you. A couple of weeks back, we planned a short camping trip. The entire hike was gorgeous. The hills are so beautiful this time of year. Oh, the day was an absolute blast. Violet caught crawdads in the river while Howard and I cooked hot dogs over a small fire by the river's shore. Hot dogs, a classic. What's your winner of choice? Hebrew Nationals. Anyways, everything was great up until we started getting ready for bed. Good choice. What happened when you went to bed? Howard and I put Violet to bed in a little tent and then began to change into our pajamas. Right before we hopped into bed, Violet came over to the front of our tent, needing to go to the bathroom. Howard put on his headlamp and went with Violet into the woods to go pee. But after a while, they hadn't come back, so I decided to go out looking for them. I knew which way they had gone, so I decided to put on a headlamp of my own and follow them out into the forest. I probably made it 200 feet before I noticed the flashing. The flashing? Yes. I didn't know what it was at first either. But then I got close enough for my headlamp to shine on this thing. It was horrible. It had this dark black fur and these horrible antlers. But, oh God, the face. When that thing looked at me, I saw evil incarnate. Because that's when I noticed the flashing was. It was Howard. The creature had his torso entirely inside its canine mouth like a snake eating an egg. I have never been so terrified in my life. Peter, as the creature shook its muzzle, the headlamp my husband wore shook too. Christ, Cheryl, I'm so sorry. Do you need a moment? No, it's okay. Let's just continue. Okay, but feel free to take your time. Okay. Before I turned from the creature and ran, I caught a glimpse of my daughter. I'm sorry, maybe I do need to take a break. Oh, that's totally fine. I'll wait here. You take your time. Cheryl was very distraught to say the least. I knew she would be, as would any mother who just lost their closest loved ones. Cheryl's story was important to me, not just because I wanted answers, but also because I knew Cheryl wanted her story to be heard. I should also let you know that she consented to the release of her interview. The tears had formed in her eyes when her husband came up in conversation, but they began pouring when Violet came into the discussion. About 10 minutes later, Cheryl came back into the dining room. Okay, I think I'm ready. No worries. Like I said, I want your grieving to be respected. You said you turned and ran from the creature when it looked at you. Oh, yeah. Although the past couple of days I've been wishing I hadn't. Life has been so painful without them. But when I ran, I ended up running straight into a frigid river, hoping that whatever was behind me wasn't a great swimmer. I fell unconscious after a few minutes. Eventually, I washed ashore nearby the opposite side of the river. Some young couple, skinny dipping in the river, found me. If it wasn't for them, I'd have died from hypothermia. Wow, Cheryl, thank you for sharing this all with me. I know how hard it can be to share a seemingly fantastical story, but I wholeheartedly believe every word you've said. I appreciate you talking with me today. Do you mind if I ask you a few follow-up questions before I head out? Actually, I know you mentioned that you had an experience of your own over the phone. What happened? Oh, well, basically, I had visited an old cabin that belonged to my uncle. I agreed to help him work on it over the summer, but he suffered a heart attack a week before we were supposed to leave. I ended up going out there alone, and it was admittedly a foolish thing. That night I saw a creature in the forest. I attempted to leave the cabin in my truck, but a mudslide pushed the truck over a cliff, and the creature found me unconscious and dragged me from the truck back to its cave. Jesus. Yeah. Well, thankfully, I think they enjoy hunting more than feeding on the dead. It had left me in its cave as it went back out to hunt. In a Deus Ex Machina type moment, I found an old flare gun in the backpack belonging to one of the creature's previous victims. When it came back, I shot the flare down its throat. Its head. Wait, you killed it? Somehow. Yeah, I did. I don't know how I got so lucky. Fuck this. If you killed that one, I bet we can kill the one that took my Howie and Violet. Wait, Cheryl, you can't be serious. These things possess otherworldly levels of aggression and capability for violence. I know you're angry, but I can't let you put your life in harm's way after you barely got away once. I have nothing left, Peter. Nothing. My parents both died from cancer, and my younger brother was killed in a car crash 2 years ago. Howard and Violet were the only family I had. I'm not asking you to come with me. All I needed to know is that these things bleed. I stopped the recording there. After several futile attempts to keep Cheryl from getting herself killed, I offered to go out to Hell's Canyon with her, to hunt this thing. There's no known cave systems existing near the Winslow's campsite, but Hell's Canyon is home to dozens of cabins. Cheryl was hoping that we find the right one. I don't know what I'm hoping for. Well, stay tuned. I'll make sure to update you guys when I get back from our expedition, if we make it back. My Uncle's Cabin, Part 3, The Hell's Canyon Expedition. The finale. Let's get straight into that. Now, before I tell you what happened out at Hell's Canyon, it is with great sadness that I must tell you it is not Peter narrating this story. It is I, Cheryl Winslow. I hold a great deal of guilt. It was my fault that Peter went out there in the first place. It was my fault that he didn't make it back. Peter was worried something like this might end up happening, and so he gave me his account information in case I made it back alive. I'm sorry. This is all my fault. Upon Peter's departure from my house here in Pendleton, I contacted a couple of friends of mine, Rita, an old college pal and an expert hunter who also knew Hell's Canyon like the back of a tattooed hand, as well as Kenneth, a mercenary-type militant who used to be one of my husband's co-workers. Well, he's a kook, but I knew I would need some firepower out there. Just after my interview was published, we met up at the Dales and loaded into my Jeep Cherokee, heading for the border of Oregon and Idaho. Hell's Canyon is absolutely gorgeous, and I would highly recommend going out to visit it if you get the chance. But, as you may soon discover, it might not be the vacation spot it once was considered to be. We followed a winding dirt road through the hillsides which eventually led us into the wooded valley surrounding the Snake River that Rita suggested we take. She said that it looked promising, and boy, was she right. I hopped out of the driver's seat and swung the heavy black door shut. Y'all ready? Rita looked at me, raising her eyebrow as if to question my intelligence. Y'all? Really, Cheryl? What? Are we in fucking Louisiana? She said with a grin on her face while pulling a hunting rifle, or .308 ammunition, from the car. Peter chimed in. Hey, this is serious. We're here. It's go time. We can't be digging around. It could cost us our lives. These animals aren't anything to be taken lightly. Kenneth spoke up while loading his 12-gauge Winchester pump shotgun. What's wrong with Louisiana, Rita? My mama was born on the bayou. He cocked his shotgun, expelling a red shotgun slug as he spit out the moist, brown glob of Copenhagen he'd been chewing on. Rita glanced at me, yet again obviously suspicious of the gun-toting redneck I'd invited. Of course she was. She scoffed and began loading a large rounds into her own rifle. "We gonna have an issue, Missy?" Kenneth said, still glaring at Rita. Frustrated, Rita turned away from the car as she pulled the metal bolt of the matte black rifle back, chambering around. Nope. Her shortness enforcing the notion that they would in fact have an issue. Come on, guys. Let's get going. We're already behind schedule," Peter said sternly, slinging his pack over his right shoulder. Reaching out, he pulled a Colt M1911 from a hand Kenneth had extended in his direction, holstering it immediately. "Where's mine, Kenny?" I asked him, implying that I was eager to get my hands on a firearm as well, something that would almost never occur at any other point in my life. Kenneth reached both hands into the back of the Cherokee. He let out a muffled grunt as he retrieved something from the trunk. "Well, Miss Cheryl, this one I brought just for you." Grinning ear to ear, he then revealed an AR-15 equipped with a holographic sight and a foregrip. "Jesus Christ! What is this, fucking Desert Storm?" Rita shouted. Kenneth, now visibly irritated, snapped back. "Do you see any ragheads around here, bitch?" This sent my 1/4 Pakistani, although you could hardly tell, friend into a fit of rage. "What did you just say, you son of a bitch? You might have some big guns, but I could kill you with my bare fucking hands, you inbred prick." And before a fist or a firefight could break out, Peter stepped in between the two polar opposites, raising his arms. "Knock this shit off, you two. You're gonna have to set your differences aside if we're gonna make it out of this forest alive." Lowering his arms and shaking his head, Peter scoffed as he began to trek into the woods. "Come on, let's move." Rita and Kenneth gave each other one final glare before we put on our packs, following after Peter. Eventually Rita took the lead. Being a Hells Canyon expert, she led our single-file line of misfits through the woods. Behind her was Peter, behind Peter was me, and behind me was Kenneth. And despite the two's altercation early on, Rita and Kenneth managed to suck down their pride, most likely due to Peter's intimidating tone. After all, he was the only one who managed to kill one of the creatures. If anyone knew what we were up against, why was him. Rita led us down towards the edge of the Snake River and turned around to face us. "All right, the first cave is about half a mile south of here. Are you guys sure you're ready?" I could tell that Rita had begun questioning the safety of our hunting trip. "Yep, it's now or never. Let's do this," I replied, faking as much confidence as I could. I nodded my head, and Rita began to guide us southbound towards the cavern. We walked in silence. No one wanted to admit it, but fear was plaguing all of our hearts. After 20 minutes of trudging through thick brush and bramble, the wooded area opened up, revealing a rock face with a small, pitch-black gap just barely large enough to crawl into. Kenneth stopped in his tracks and threw his hands up in the air. "Ah, hell no. I'm not going in that fucking hole." Rita, instantly recognizing this opportunity, replied sardonically, "Don't be a pussy, Kenny," simultaneously glaring and grinning at Kenneth. Kenneth plopped his semi-overweight bottom down on a nearby rock, set his shotgun on the ground, and leaned back, putting his hands behind his head. "You are what you eat." A smug grin grew on his face as we all let out an audible groan. Peter, not wanting to give Kenneth any attention, began to debrief us. "Okay, whatever. Kenny, you stay here. I guess you can keep watch. You two, let's get our headlamps on and let's do this thing." Sweat dribbled down the side of Peter's head, possibly from the warm, thick air, possibly from fear of what was yet to come. Rita and I nodded in agreement as we set down our packs and reached into one of the top pockets, pulling out LED headlamps with black straps. "Yes, sir," Rita replied as she strapped on her lamp. "Let's do this." Rita once again led her descent into the dark cavern, hunting rifle on her back swaying as she crawled through the small opening. And after a few minutes of claustrophobic crawling, muffled grunts, and several scrapes which had accumulated on her arms, the cavern expanded. Now Peter pulled a red flare from his back pocket. Upon striking the flare, the damp cave was illuminated with bright red light. Here we are, Peter declared, pulling the handgun from his leather holster and sliding the hammer back, double-checking that the pistol was in fact loaded. Rita swung the hunting rifle from her back and into the palms of her calloused hands. So, what do we do if we see one of these, things? Peter, straight-faced, turned around and answered Rita's question. Shoot it, till it drops to the fucking floor. He turned back around and began to lead us further down into the cave. Eventually, we came across a solid rock wall blocking any further movement. Shit, dead end, I said, frustrated that we hadn't found what we were looking for, and relieved that we hadn't found our demise. Back to square one, Peter said, letting out a sigh as he began to trudge back up the mouth of the cave. We successfully managed to crawl out of the cave and back into the bright eastern Oregon sunshine. However, as we exited the cave, all three of us immediately noticed something. Kenneth was gone. Now Peter, cupping his hands around his mouth, began to shout into the woods. Kenny! Kenny! Kenny, where are you? Fuck! Just then, something cracked on the forest floor. We all swiveled around immediately. Walking out from beneath the dark canopy was a 6-foot-tall figure. It was Kenneth. Zipping up his dirty jeans and presumably wiping piss on the blue denim, he cracked a smile and exclaimed, You didn't think one of them beasties got me, did you? Christ, Kenny, what the fuck? I yelled, furious that he hadn't either peed closer to the cave or just held it in. Rita rolled her eyes. Oh, thank goodness, she responded, once again slinging the rifle behind her back. I did the same. After the initial spelunking mission, we investigated 5 more similar limestone caverns to no avail before setting up camp for the night. We found a small clearing in the woods and unrolled our sleeping bags, lit a small campfire, and began to discuss our next move. Peter sat upon a log near the fire, pulling a can of warm, past blue ribbon from his pack. He began brainstorming. There's a shit ton of caves in this area. Or it could take weeks, maybe months before we thoroughly explore each of them. Maybe we should just call it a trip and head out in the morning. We can always potentially come back after we do some more research. He sipped the warm beer, grimacing. Fuck that. We have plenty of supplies. We can stay out here for at least a week before we need to head back into town. I'm not leaving until we find something. I frustratingly replied, my mind clouded with the thought of revenge, not heeding the warning Peter had given us. It makes no difference to me. I'll take any opportunity to spend a night underneath the night sky. Rita laid on top of her insulated blue sleeping bag. Standing up, she declared, Hey, I have to pee. I'll be right back. We'll turn towards her. Are you sure you want to go alone? I asked, remembering what happened earlier with Kenneth. She nodded her head, her thick brown hair bobbed along with it, illuminated by the orange light of the campfire. Yeah, I have a shy bladder. Pete, can I take a coat with me? I prefer to be caught with my pants down, holding a handgun, rather than scrambling for my bolt action. Yeah, sure. Here you go. Peter stood up from his log and leaned over towards Rita, handing her the small, silver hand cannon. Thanks. I'll be right back. Save a beer for me? Rita asked, smiling, before heading into the woods. Peter raised his white can in her direction. You got it. Just like that, my friend had vanished into the darkness of the thick wooded region. She had grown up with divorced parents. Her mom taught her ways of activism and strength through femininity, while her dad taught her the ways of the hunter and strength through nature. I trusted her to be on her own, even more so than Kenneth, our resident militant. Speaking of the gun nut, Kenneth had set his shotgun against the side of a pine tree and zipped open his large green pack, pulling out a small, yellow cooler. We can stay here a couple of nights, but I think we need to go back into town and rethink our strategy. I think if we're going to find anything, this is easily the least efficient way to do it," Peter said, taking another sip from his beer and staring at the pine needle riddled ground. I sighed, sucking down my pride. Yeah, maybe that's not the worst idea. I kicked to the ground, sending clumps of dirt and sap towards the campfire. Kenneth pulled a square, yellow plastic package from his cooler. Ripping open the package, he pulled out a stick of cold meat. He slid it onto the stick he had sharpened with his pocket knife, then raised it above the crackling flame as it began to sizzle. "Shit, not a bad idea, Kenny," Peter said while also reaching into his pack and pulling out a small Ziploc baggie with a turkey sandwich inside. "You should eat, Cheryl. You need the calories." Peter held out half the sandwich in my direction. Accepting a small meal, I replied softly, "Thanks." "Are you sure we ain't just hunting a lost grizzly?" Kenneth questioned, slowly looking up from the fire towards me. Infuriated, I laid into him. "What the fuck, Kenny? You and Howard were close friends and you're going to sit there and say that a bear did that to him? Fuck off. You've been nothing but intolerable this entire fucking excursion. I don't even know why I asked you to tag along." I moved my gaze from Kenny's alarmed face to the dirty ground beneath my feet. "Damn, well, sorry," is all Kenneth had to say, before a sound that can only be described as an audible version of the Holocaust rattled through the forest. Peter dropped the sandwich in shock and scanned the forest as Kenny's face grew ghostly pale. We then turned to face the thudding coming from behind us. We all swung our bodies towards the stomping, and in similar fashion as earlier in the day, Rita burst through the dark forest edge. Panting, Rita bent over and put her hands on her knees. "Holy shit! What the fuck was that?" Frozen in fear, none of us had time to answer her, as a hulking, shadowy mass slowly formed behind my dear old friend. The same shadowy mass that killed my husband and daughter. Confused as to why we hadn't responded, Rita began. What's... before she was interrupted. A large, furry brown clawed hand with a palm the size of a dinner plate wrapped its razor-sharp talons around Rita's skull. She barely had time to scream or fight back before the thing twisted her head off of her spine like the cap of a beer bottle. Her lifeless body fell to the ground with a loud thud. Her head and eyes rolled back, still in the clutches of the beast's left hand. The monster tightened its grip around Rita's skull. A wet crunch let out through the air as her head was reduced to pink mush, lined with dark hair. "Oh, fuck. Let's get out," Kenneth shouted. But before he could even think to stand up, a pair of antlers which resembled a Norwegian black metal band's logo burst through his ribcage. Being raised up into the air, his flailing body vomited up a few globs of blood before the second beast with grey fur stood up at a towering 10 feet tall and pulled him from its antlers and ripped him in half vertically like a piece of fleshy construction paper. Blood showered Peter and I, and as the droplets collided with the campfire, a quick sizzle escaped the hot orange flame. The 6-foot-long halves of Kenneth dropped to the ground, squishing and expelling more gore from his insides. Peter dove for Kenny's Winchester, which still leaned upon one of the nearby trees. "Cheryl, start running!" Peter shouted in my direction, whilst he grabbed the shotgun and aimed for the grey monstrosity that now lunged at him. Bang! Peter pulled the shotgun's trigger, nailing the creature in its left shoulder and staggering it as it let out a harsh screech. The blood coursing through my veins had been replaced with dread, but nonetheless I took this opportunity and made a mad dash in the direction of the car. I was over 2 miles away, but it was the only chance of escape we had, and Peter followed, and so did the brown creature, eventually followed by the grey one once it had regained its balance. The AR-15 pounding against my back, I sprinted through the forest, crunching twigs and leaves as I dodged thick tree trunks in the night shroud of darkness. After making it about 150 feet, I foolishly took a peek over my shoulder, just in time to see the same large brown hand reaching for my head as it did Rita's. Eyes widened with visceral terror, the palm at the top of my skull plucking me up off the ground as if I were an ant. I screamed, kicked and swatted at the creature as it licked its muzzle with a long, wet, purple tongue. Bang! In an instant, accompanied by a blinding flash and a deafening crack, the creature's cranium was tore from its skull as a slug left the barrel of the Winchester, sending me onto my ass and its lifeless body to the ground. "Fucking go, Cheryl! Peter commanded towards me as a large grey hand grabbed him by his upper leg and dangled him in the air. With a swift rip, the creature grabbed Peter's shoulder and separated his torso from his legs, spilling his entrails onto the ground with a sickening plop. Peter met his gruesome fate because I chose to go out there. The guilt I feel is immeasurable. All three of my friends have been murdered by these beasts, and I wasn't going to go down without a fight. I reached behind my back and yanked the high-powered assault rifle into my hands, left hand on the foregrip, right index finger on the trigger. With a mix of rage, terror, and self-preservation, I let out a shrill scream as my finger rapidly pressed down on the heavy trigger, sending dozens of 5.56 rounds flying out of the barrel and into the forest. Not one hit the creature, at least not until the final click did a round leave the chamber and saw directly into the creature's right eyeball. The eye erupted, spewing blood and optic fluid like a volcano of gore as the thing let out the worst noise I'd ever heard. Now holding its bloodied eye with its right hand, the thing snarled at me one more time before trotting into the darkness on all fours, whimpering. I wish I could have stayed and mourned my dear friends, but I knew that I couldn't let their deaths be meaningless. I had to make it out of Hell's Canyon alive. And by the time I made it back to the car, it was dawn, the gentle blues and oranges reflecting off the windshield of my black Jeep Cherokee. And thankfully, I had remembered to attach the car keys to the carabiner and clipped it to my belt. I removed the keys and opened the car door, and as I put the keys into ignition, the thought of my friends' corpses swam through my mind. I drove to the closest ranger station and alerted them to what had happened, and simultaneously dumbfounded and suspicious, they went out to where I had just left. Hours passed before they came back, and ultimately they couldn't figure out what happened. There were no remains found of either of my friends or the monster, just 4 red grease marks on the forest floor. I wish I could give you a happy ending to this story. I wish I could tell you it's safe to go into the woods, but I cannot in good faith do either. I'm sorry for all of this. Please beware the creatures that roam eastern Oregon. They've taken everything from me, and they'll just as quickly take everything from you. Wow. Wow. Suddenly another one. Wow. Chest pounding and intriguing story there, and I always do really enjoy a good Wendigo story. We don't really see too many Wendigo stories on Reddit these days, or at least not in a completed story form. As ever though, a huge thank you to the incredible author, PeterVOX19, over on Reddit No Sleep. I hope you enjoyed my rendition, Peter, and I certainly look forward to more of your work in the future. Well, guys and girls as ever, you know the drill. Please do let me know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help with the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid Crew. If you're an aspiring writer or would just like to have a crack at things, like myself, then please do get in touch with me at the contact email, which is, as on screen, contactthedeadone@gmail.com. I really look forward to hearing from you. I hope everybody's had a fantastic week at work or school. Whatever it is that you do, I hope you're enjoying it and taking a fight back to life. But above all, guys, remember, be safe, not sorry.